I want to talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his model of distributive justice. It is spread across two works, The Discourse on the Origin of Inequality and On the Social Contract. Here I'm going to be talking primarily about On the Social Contract. But the other work is relevant as well. It gives us a story, not really exactly a historical story, somewhat an imaginative story of how people end up in a situation of injustice. It defines something like the fall of man in moral terms, and then the social contract lays out the solution to that problem. The social contract of Rousseau, like any social contract theory, starts with a picture of the state of nature. Now, people often summarize it as a noble savage view, but that's quite misleading if you look at the details of the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Because in that work, he says, well, yes, in some ways, the state of nature would have started out in an idyllic way. We would be, in effect, like animals. All our needs could be satisfied by nature. He envisions us living by the stream, having fresh water, being able to find food by foraging in the forests, and in general, being in a situation that seems pretty ideal. All our needs are satisfied, he says. But actually, the state of nature itself begins to fall apart. Why? Because people are competitive. They want more than they need. They want a better position on the stream. They want better food. They want to be there first to pick the best apples, and so on. They would like the most attractive mates. In short, they are going to compete with other people, even in the state of nature, for various kinds of social goods. And that competition can easily become quite nasty. It leads to anger, it leads to hostility, it leads to revenge. Think about the kind of social competition that might occur in a middle school lunchroom when all the teachers leave the room for some reason. Okay, that's his vision of how the state of nature evolves very quickly, actually, from this noble savage image where all our needs are satisfied to something that is very far from being idyllic. Now, he thinks in that kind of setting we would begin trying out various other kinds of social contracts, including the kinds of social contracts that are developed by Locke and by Hobbes. He sees them as appropriate to a certain stage of our development. But, he thinks, there is a critical stage of that development where things go wrong and where a Lockean type of contract, for example, becomes completely inappropriate. He says the true founder of civil society is the first person to enclose a plot of land, say, "This is mine," and find people fool enough to believe him. So it was the advent of private property, private ownership of land, that he thinks breaks apart the whole Lockean scheme. And really it's the development of agriculture. People no longer hunting and gathering primarily, but instead growing crops. He says that changed things fundamentally, because in hunting and gathering, nobody has to own the forest, nobody has to own the land. They can simply move about nomadically. But agriculture isn't like that. You can't plant wheat and then just move along. The person who planted the wheat, who works to grow it and so on, is going to be the one who expects to get the benefits from it. And so it breaks apart this. All of a sudden, it becomes to your advantage to own things. It becomes to your advantage to rope things off and exclude other people from your land. It becomes to your advantage to have an even bigger farm and then hire other people to work that land. And so employment, slavery, a variety of relationships between human beings of an economic kind, he says, arise at the level of agriculture that simply weren't there before. And you might say all of business ethics arises out of that. Lots of organizational ethics, no matter what the kind of organization, arises out of that kind of combination of effort that is required for agriculture in a way that it's not really required in a hunter-gatherer society. You can go off to the woods by yourself and pick up acorns. You can go out and hunt squirrels by yourself. You can't really run a farm by yourself. And so we've got a problem now, he says, and it's a problem that, I won't go through all the stages of it, but leads to more and more serious inequality, till we get to the point where a few are gorging themselves on luxuries while the multitude lack necessities. That's the ending of the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. And the social contract then begins with an attempt to solve that problem. The first sentence, which is famous, says, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." How does that come about? Rousseau here says, I have no idea. But actually the discourse gave us a story about how that might have come about. But he does say, I think I can provide the solution. I think I can explain how to free us from our chains. And that's what the book on the social contract is really all about. Like Hobbes and Locke, Rousseau is a social contract theorist. So let's think about his social contract in the terms we've been using, thinking about it as having three parts: a choice between a state of nature and a state under which we are subject to political authority, some criteria for making that choice, and then some principles we might adopt for determining what would be just, what would be legitimate within the context we agree to. Recall that Rousseau thinks that the social contract is what converts force into right and possession into property. There are no rights in the state of nature, but there are civil rights, rights that we gain from government by putting ourselves under political authority. So, what are those rights, and what does this choice look like in the first place? We might ask how that transformation is accomplished. And he says this: the problem is to find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. This is the fundamental problem of which the social contract provides the solution. So he wants a transformation of force into right and possession into property, while at the same time leaving us as free as before. In the state of nature, we're not subject to political authority. We are free. Man is born free, remember. Yet everywhere he is in chains. How is this possible? What on earth made that legitimate? The answer is we voluntarily submitted to that authority. That's something every social contract theory believes. Well, maybe not that we did, but that in ideal circumstances we would. Now, why would we? The state of nature for Rousseau is not a state of war. It is not even, as in Locke, a state where posses, vigilante groups, and so on keep a rough peace. It's not the Wild West. Instead, he says, it's a situation where we would face difficulties. Imagine trying to get through the winter in Switzerland all by yourself. It would be a difficult prospect. And so he says, we find that there are certain things that we can accomplish much better if we cooperate with others. So, the criterion he's focused on here is in part this matter of converting force into right. We would like to actually have rights rather than simply have to defend ourselves by force. So there is a bit of a Hobbesian element here. We want to convert possession into property. He denies Locke's claim that our labor does that automatically. And we want freedom. We want to be as free as we were before. But we also want to gain the fruits of cooperation. So we are going to seek a political authority that does that, that converts force into right, possession into property, that makes us as free as we were before, and that gives us the fruits of cooperating, because together we can accomplish so much more than we can accomplish separately. In fact, his example of this is a stag hunt, and I've got a separate video about stag hunts in game theory, but the general idea is if we agree to cooperate and if we can trust one another to cooperate, then we can accomplish much better outcomes than we can do on our own in certain circumstances at any rate. So the state of nature is one where it's simply difficult to live. We can't cooperate with others. We don't have any system for actually agreeing to give anyone any right to anything. We don't, in a certain sense, even have the ability to reach agreements with people. We create an authority that enables us to reach those agreements, to trust one another, to cooperate with one another. And it's got to be one, he says, that leaves us as free as before. Now, how do we do it? Well, in Hobbes, we trade a large amount of our liberty to gain security. In Locke, we give up our right to enforce the law of nature ourselves in exchange for impartial judgment. In Rousseau, we find life difficult, and we're willing to commit ourselves completely to the group. We're willing to cooperate fully in exchange for the fruits of cooperation. So the way he puts it is this: I am willing to give up everything to the group. I fully commit myself to cooperating. But what do I gain? I gain, he says, everything back. Now, at first glance, you might think, wait, I don't understand. I trade everything, I get everything back? It's something like trading baseball cards with somebody else, and you say, I'll give you all of my cards if you give me all of your cards. And he says, I tell you what, I'll take all of your cards and I'll give them right back to you. Well, okay, what's the point? Here's the general idea, though. I am giving up everything in the sense that I am committing to cooperation. And what I get back is everything in the sense of my fair share of the fruits of cooperation. So the idea is, look, I cooperate and then I am a full partner in the result of that cooperation. And we can do much better cooperating, working together, than we can do separately. So that's what I gain. Now, what does that mean about the principles I adopt? And what does it mean about, then, distributive justice? Who deserves what in that case? How do we distribute the goods and the responsibilities of society? Rousseau puts it this way: each man, in giving himself to all, gives himself to nobody. And as there is no associate over whom he does not acquire the same right, as he yields others over himself, he gains an equivalent for everything he loses, and an increase of force for the preservation of what he has. Now you might think, then, that if I'm guaranteed the fruits of cooperation, I have a right to something. I have a right to my fair share of the fruits. And indeed, sometimes Rousseau talks that way. But we've got to be careful, because I am committing myself fully to cooperation. I am putting myself fully under the command of the sovereign. The sovereign is the one who, then, is wielding power in that system of political authority that I've created. I create the state, and the sovereign is the one who leads the state. Now, he talks as if this is a monarchy. That's not actually what he has in mind. But the idea is the sovereign is simply the set, you might say, of people who are exercising political authority, who are exercising the power. Well, what then could we say about the obligations of the sovereign? Surprisingly, perhaps, the sovereign doesn't really have obligations to us. We've committed ourselves fully. We've given ourselves up fully to the state. So, he says, there neither is nor can be any kind of fundamental law binding on the body of the people, not even the social contract itself. Now you may think, well, wait a minute. Okay, I'm giving up everything here. I'm committing myself fully to the group. And in response, the leader of the group owes me nothing? I mean, I get nothing out of that? I get no right out of that? You're saying, oh, you'll get the fruits of cooperation. But that sounds like a criminal gang where, in the end, the leader, the Don, can just take everything for himself. And I'm really dependent fully and owe nothing. And nothing is owed to me. Well, he says, don't worry. The sovereign, being formed wholly of the individuals who compose it, neither has nor can have any interest contrary to theirs. So the state and the sovereign cannot have any interest that is contrary to your interests. Their job is to look out for the whole, and it's your interest that the interests of the whole thrive. So don't worry. You're in no trouble. Your interest and the interest of the sovereign coincide. Consequently, the sovereign power need give no guarantee to its subjects, because it's impossible for the body to wish to hurt all its members. We shall also see later that it can't hurt any in particular. The sovereign, merely by virtue of what it is always what it should be. This is something that echoes later in political philosophy, in Hegel, for example, in Woodrow Wilson, in the progressive movement. In the words of Barack Obama, government is just what we do together. Basically, the idea that Rousseau starts is the government can never do wrong. It can never harm its citizens simply because the true interests of the citizens are one with the interests of the state. And so as long as it looks out for the interests of the state, it is looking out for the interests of each individual citizen. But you might say, wait a minute, what if my will does not go along with the will of the state? What if I don't like what the government is doing, and I get into big trouble? Let's say I'm thrown into prison. Maybe I'm even executed by the government. I say, that's in my interest. Rousseau says again, The general will, which is his term for the common good, may of course disagree with the will of a person, an individual person within that community. But he says, well, in that case, the community's interests, have to take precedence. But again, you shouldn't worry that your rights are being violated or that your interests are being lost, because he says, whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the entire body. This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free. The government then can force you to be free, can force you to be free by imprisoning you, force you to be free by executing you, simply because it can force you to conform your will to the will of the state and to eliminate your will if you won't do it.